Good evening. I want to extend a huge thanks to all of you for joining us tonight for the first official event in our rollout of FairnMed 2.0. Tonight's conversation with Dr. Stephen Levine and Dr. Chris Kalibi. Dr. Levine will be joining us a little later. This will be the first in a two-part series on the CAS review. I'm especially excited about this webinar because it's also the first time our community will meet Dr. Nikki Johnson, our interim co-director of FairnMed, and we're so thrilled to have her on board and super excited about the great material she has planned in the coming months. I'd also like to add that our session tonight will be a trial for our 90-minute format going forward. As we broaden the subject matter that FairnMed tackles, we'll also be diving deeper into these issues. So we're trying to make this experience more interactive for our attendees and provide more time for questions and answers. So at the end of tonight's webinar, we'll post a link for you to leave your feedback. We'd really love to hear from you because we're trying to make these events as enjoyable and valuable as possible. And you can help us do that by sharing your thoughts. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Johnson.
All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This is my first webinar as the co-interim director of FairnMed. So I am very excited to be starting this journey and picking up where Dr. Mendoza left off. And just before our last break with our last webinar, we were talking about the gender issue and gender services, gender medicine, however you want to frame it, right before England published its final review, large systemic review on this topic, better known as the CAS review. I'm not sure if everybody in the audience has heard it. I know that a lot of you have who are FAIR members and have followed us along, but there may be some new people who are joining us. That makes me excited. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what the CAS review is. And we will talk about the response of the Europeans and the American medical organizations and public health agencies in tonight's webinar. Next week, on June 13th, we will actually talk about the CAS review from a different angle, from the angle of the journalists in the European nations and in the United States. Because they are a significant part of spreading the news and also helping us to, obviously share information so that it can influence policy. So they are a big part of our response to new evidence and new information. So tonight, and that discussion will be led by FAIR advisor and journalist Lisa Sellen-Davis. Tonight, we have distinguished panelists, Drs. Christopher Kalibi and Dr. Stephen Levine. Dr. Levine will be joining us in the 9 o'clock hour, but I will give the introductions for both of them right now. And then when he joins us, he pops in, he'll join the conversation. So Dr. Kalibi, hello, sir.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining me. For those who don't know, Dr. Kalibi, he is a professor of psychiatry at the University of South Florida in Tampa, Florida. He's board certified in psychiatry, child and adolescent psychiatry, and forensic psychiatry. Wears a lot of hats. Lots of board certifications here too. He's a distinguished fellow at the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, or the AACAP. From 2013 to 2021, he served as the co-chair of their media committee. His clinical work is primarily at 3 places: university clinics, the federal qualified health centers, and also juvenile corrections. And so Dr. Kalibi at USF, it's hard to get that in, like thinking about UCSF. Dr. Kalibi instructs medical students, psychiatry residents, and child and adolescent psychiatry fellows and forensic psychiatry fellows. So lots of hats for you, Dr. Kalibi. All right. let's start off with, I know that you wrote an immediate response to the CAS review when it was first published. And so we'll just start off talking about what that review was, and then what was kind of your initial response being an American doctor here. So the England's CAS review, they published their final report on April 10th. The report was commissioned by the National Health Service of the UK in 2020 in order to look at all of the scientific evidence throughout the world, basically, and treatment guidelines for children with concerns about their sex not matching their gender identity, or in other words, gender dysphoria diagnosis. But we'll talk a little bit about how that's worded and what we think that term should really be. Really just they commissioned reviews of all of these different subjects and different parts. And so there were 8 large systematic reviews, which are really the standard bearer for us making guidelines for medical procedures and medical procedures, treatments, and diagnoses. And so it looks at multiple studies. They have defined criteria that they're looking for that meets the review standards. If we can get a randomized controlled trial, those are the best quality studies. But that's not always possible with certain types of studies when you have live patients going through something where they can easily detect a difference in treatment. So a lot of these studies are not randomized control studies, but we look at all of those studies, make sure they meet our criteria and high standards for statistical analysis and really answering the question that they set out to answer. And then we decide, what's the best evidence out of all of these different studies. And this is what the CAS review did for this topic. They went through international studies on different topics, like what puberty blockers should be used for, what are the benefits of puberty blockers, what are the side effects of puberty blockers, all different, really topics on the subtopics in the gender medicine scope. And then they also looked at clinical practices, specifically in England, so then that they could put together the scientific evidence and what's actually happening in practice there, and then decide what's the best treatment for England's children. And so a lot of the criticism that the CAS review has gotten is, a lot of people will say, well, that was just done for children in England. It wasn't just, it wasn't done for children in the United States. So what we can take from the CAS review is the scientific evidence that was reviewed in all of these countries. Well, hello, Dr. Levine's joining us a little bit early, so I can sneak you in. I just went over a general gist of what the CAS reviews are, just so that the audience members who are not familiar with that will understand. So Dr. Levine is a clinical professor of psychiatry at Case Western Reserve University here in Cleveland with me, and also my undergraduate and medical school alma mater. He's a practicing psychiatrist at an independent practice. He's at that practice. He is the director of gender diversity program. He's also a distinguished life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. So welcome, to the webinar, Dr. Levine? You're muted. And I can't unmute you. There you go. Oh, almost. Welcome.
All right, I think you can hear me now.
Yes, we can. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. All right. So, Dr. Kalibi and Dr. Levine, let's just take a step back and let's talk about why we needed the CAS review in the first place. What was it necessary? Why is it such a big deal? Let's talk about that. And either of you can chime in. Dr. Levine, maybe since you were kind of a part of the initial guidelines and standards of care through WPATH, or the World Psychiatric Association for Transgender Medicine, would you mind just giving us a little bit of kind of a brief history of what led us up to the CAS review?
Well, just to pick on your phraseology.
Okay.
We didn't need the CAS review. Britain needed the CAS review.
Okay.
Because the British had sensibilities that they had indications that the kids that the science behind what was happening and the explosion of children, especially biologic girls, the explosion of the number of people requesting help at their specialty clinics overwhelmed them. And there was some indication that the quality of care was not adequate and that children were being rushed into hormonal treatment as though that was the best thing to do for all the children. And they couldn't even serve all the children who were requesting evaluation. So there, a couple of years, Europe adopted the Dutch protocol that was published in final form in 2014. And so European countries and the UK and Wales and Scotland began doing this kind of treatment. And I think many clinicians noticed that the kids weren't doing very well who had the treatment. And so I just think because England has a national health service and they have a value system that all the care should be based upon the best science available. There was growing consideration. There was growing concern when the CAS report when the suggestion that there would be an investigation. There was great concern that things aren't going well with this form of treatment. And so they did, I think we have to take our hats off to the British people, whomever they were, that decided that they would put so much time and effort and money into a first class, and I would say best in the class, evaluation of this whole treatment, affirmative care treatment. We are the beneficiaries of this. Americans didn't think they needed the CAS report. In fact, many people in America are trying to find reasons to criticize the CAS report. But it arose because of a small country, England, Wales, and Scotland had major concerns. Certain people, observers in medicine, had major concerns about what was happening. And they decided to, because they had lots of evidence that there were critics around, not only their clinicians, but in the literature, there were growing criticisms. And they decided that they wanted to improve the quality of care. And in order to do that, based on their values, I believe they said we have to do a first class evaluation. And that's what the CAS report did, I think. And I know I take my hat off to them. I'm very admiring and grateful to not only the report, but how the report is presented.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to phrase that. I'm gonna let you weigh in, Dr. Kalibi, on whether or not you think that the rest of the world needed the CAS review.
Well, I agree with Dr. Levine that England needed the review, but we also, I mean, this is the most substantial look at gender care in children and adolescents. And I think because they have a tradition in England because it's a closed health system and the National Health Service is used to reviewing different problems and kind of figuring out, okay, what's the best evidence for, whooping cough or a broken leg or, appendicitis. So they routinely review their care. So they had a structure in place for one. I think that because of the history which Dr. Levine had kind of talked about, there was already problems in their major gender clinic. If you read Hannah Barnes' book, Time to Think, you will see the year after year, a number of people had raised concerns about this type of care. Yeah. You have to consider that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for kids are probably the most profound interventions that we would sort of voluntarily do on a kid, that doesn't have a major life-threatening illness. I mean, these are major interventions. And I think a lot of people were skeptical. I think everywhere in the world, there are a lot of people who are skeptical, but a lot of people were raising questions in England about what was going on. It's also, gender affirming care, that is these cross-sex hormones or puberty blockers are called, is a deviation from normal clinical practice. It's not usual practice. It's a very unusual thing that we would intervene at that age with those type of procedures in a still developing individual. And so questions were raised. They had a procedure that they would typically use to review things. They had an infrastructure kind of ready to go. And yes, I think, the National Health Service and Dr. Cass did a great job putting together a very thoughtful review. They did a lot of the legwork, which I would have hoped that, someone would have maybe organized over here. Our systems are way behind where they are in terms of taking an honest look at the evidence and reviewing what the evidence says, we should do. So yeah, I think they did need it because they had a mess there. The Tavistock Clinic was overwhelmed with patients, as Dr. Levine was saying. They couldn't serve them all. They also were concerns about the treatments they were getting. They had done their own test of the puberty blockers, which really didn't have great results. So they actually had done their own study, which had pretty much shown that this is not a treatment that has the great success that they had thought they were going to get based on the studies from the Netherlands. So I think for many reasons they were in a good position to assess what was going on, and they also had major problems in their gender clinics, just like we have in ours. And thank goodness they put together a high quality report that we can all learn from.
Yeah.
Can I just answer your question?
Go ahead.
I just want to say the difference is that they had the need and they had the will. The United States has the need. We have the need for this.
Okay.
We don't have the will.
Okay, so yes, that's where I was going to push back on, because I believe, from a pediatrician end of things, because that's my background, I was watching as the United States and the American Academy of Pediatrics decided to just say, in 2018, just say, okay, we're doing this. We're just going to start giving kids puberty blockers and and sexualizing hormones. And I was just like, whoa, wait a minute, what? We're based on what evidence? And so I felt like, it was something that we absolutely needed before we even started doing this. And I didn't feel like we had the data. Yes, we do have different health systems, but why was it different for gender medicine when we do study other medical problems, psychiatric problems, and start treatments based on evidence? Like what made this different?
Can I start with that one? Because I think also, if you look at American medicine, I believe that in general, we are very interventionalist. We really like to do things, and we get paid to do things too. So everyone needs to keep that in mind. So sitting and thinking about things is not rewarded in general in the American medical system.
Absolutely.
And so we are generally leaning our system currently, and I think you could make a very strong case for many aspects of American medicine being over-diagnosis and over-treatment. This is also a system where if there's a market and it can get paid for, then it can happen here, right? So this is a place that's ripe for people getting ahead of the evidence. We a lot of times over intervene because doctors get into medicine because they want to help, and they think that what they're doing is a help, but it is also something that, for them can be rewarding, or that makes them, feel like they're doing a good thing. And I think in gender medicine, the distress that they were seeing, they wanted to help. I think you also can't take out some kind of ideological, political element to this. And there are those that are in the field that seem to want to break down barriers and change culture. And, I think there is a positive desire for more acceptance of gender nonconforming people and a wider swath of gender behaviors being okay. I think that was a ideological, political message that had some good in it. That was part of what, and so I think a lot of the gender doctors in the States felt like they were really doing this great thing and felt like they were helping a lot. But obviously, and we can see that they were doing stuff that didn't have an evidence to back it. And people that were more cautious or thoughtful would wonder, for one, if you're going to do this, wouldn't you want to measure very carefully whether or not you're getting, especially when you're intervening on a young person, you would really hope that you'd be measuring your results very well, so you know that you're actually helping the people you say you're helping. And for two, when the population changes and grows, before you apply a treatment which was originally for early onset gender dysphoria, and we can, debate, I think that we do debate whether or not this is a good treatment even for that population. But then when you expand it, so I think once again, the interventionalist type of medicine system we have then in the States took off. And then the people who are involved with this, who believe they're doing the right thing, it's very easy for a few people to get together at the American Academy of Pediatrics or ACAP or APA and get on the gender committees, tell the people who run the larger organizations, hey, we have this great intervention and we want to make that the standard. And there's really not any crosstalk. So you can have kind of what I would say is a thought bubble within those committees, which then advocated very strongly and pushed the organizations. And the organizations, I think, philosophically were aligned and sort of able to be convinced of something that wasn't true. But they also, we usually just depend on our experts in the different committees to present things that are actually progress in care. And so when you think of something that's coming out of, let's say, the psychopharmacology committee at ACAP, you would assume, oh, there's a psychopharmacologist. They probably have good ideas. Maybe what they're saying is the right thing. And so people assume, because medicine has become very fragmented, that people in these committees know what they're doing. And I think we overly trusted them, and they became overly ideological. And then the organizations got behind it. And, I think that basically is how we got to this place, is that there was like a capture, an ideological capture by a very small group of people. If you look at the number of people who really were involved with WPATH and were involved in these committees, it's really not a lot. But they steered us all in the wrong direction, and here we are.
Yeah, and that's the part that's really concerning and baffling for me, because I saw that there was ideological capture in a lot of things, political capture even, in the AAP. And in 2018, when they published these guidelines, that's when I left the AAP. And I feel like, the people like us who will push back and ask questions, if we're not silenced, we just leave and don't push back. I tried to push back within the system, and I know that there's definitely were people within the AAP who were writing resolutions at AAP meetings and trying to submit them and getting rejected and or getting voted down, to just take a pause, put on the brakes, and then relook at this before we issue, blanket policy statements about this in particular. But I saw this same thing with COVID. I mean, you can name a bunch of different things. It just seems like it has accelerated though, in the last few years. I mean, I would maybe last 10 years. It's just this ramp up that we're going to respond to social, cultural, and political pressure. And I don't understand why we decide to throw away all of our ethical and moral character. And that's what medicine and science is about, that we take time to look at the evidence. We think about we think about the potential harms, and we do a risk-benefit analysis before mentioning, before offering something or recommending something. And we also provide informed consent. And that is one of the big pieces out of this that I think is, really missing, particularly about the puberty blockers and how, we're telling parents that this is, these are reversible, completely reversible if we want to, or this is actually, going to mitigate suicide and other mental distress in your child. Those things that we had no proof of, but we were saying it anyway, or at least we thought we had proof, but we really didn't examine the evidence, or it wasn't even available to us because there's a transparency problem as well. So I don't know. Dr. Levine, do you have anything else to add on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to you said, why did this take off in America? And I think in order to answer that question, you need a complex answer. And I agree, Chris summarized it very nicely. But what I would add to that is that I think you need to separate the answer to the question for pediatrics, for mental health, for endocrinology, and for surgery.
Yes.
I think the answers are different for each of the category. And I want to speak for psychiatry, that's for people like me, mental health professionals. I want you to know that when people say this is a complex case, I think I've never seen a simple case.
Right.
See, I don't buy this business that, you're complex and you're simple. Right. Otitis media may be simple for a pediatrician, but the things that we deal with, like adolescent depression, that's not simple ever. Right. Or rarely simple. Right.
Yeah. And otitis media is not simple either.
Well, right. Thank you for saying that. Right. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that if you're a mental health professional and you have a stream of patients all day or half a day, whatever, you know how hard it is to address the fundamental issue and to ameliorate the suffering of that person. We have techniques. The efficacy of those techniques are pretty low, whether it's this medicine or this kind of psychotherapy or this intervention. And so many of these children have multiple diagnoses. And the mental health professional, once there were gender teams, gender clinics called specialists, the doctor said, oh, this is gender dysphoria, let's send them to somebody else. They thought they were going to get a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation from the gender specialist. They didn't know that the gender specialist already had affirmative care in mind, right? And they had this belief that if we give this kid what he wants, or what we think he will benefit him, all those other problems will go away. And I think probably the British, I know we have seen that they didn't go away, but the British were, very smart about this and very organized about this. And, Britain and the European countries have an advantage that they're small. We have 50 different boards of medicine in the United States.
Yeah.
And the only central organization is Medicare, Medicaid. And the same insurance companies have different policies in every state.
Yes.
You can see that we need the respect-worthy work of Hillary Cass and her committees to raise questions we need to rethink this in the United States, you see. And we need to hold pediatricians and psychiatrists and psychologists and family counselors and endocrinologists and surgeons. We need to hold them responsible to the values that you were talking about, Dr. Johnson.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, what was interesting, I was just at the APA meeting in New York City earlier this month, and I was just having, casual discussions about this with several of the attendees. And one lady said, actually more than a couple people said to me, well, the APA gets their cues from the American Academy of Pediatrics. And I said, well, I'm pretty sure that the AAP is getting guidelines from WPATH and psychiatrists also. So it's really funny that it was almost this blame game that, you started this and, and we listen to you. We listen to you. No, we listen to you. And like, okay, so that's a great, there's an audience question that I think is excellent at related to this. And Larry Sarner asked, how did gender medicine in America and Europe skip the experimental phase and go right to full practice of medicalization and surgical interventions? Because even though we say that the Europeans are smart and they, decided to put the brakes on and start looking at things, they also just sort of, they took the Dutch protocol and just went full speed ahead with it too. So how did that start?
That's a wonderful question. I'll give you a tentative hypothesis. I would say, speaking about me personally, I am much more sophisticated today in critical sensibilities than I was 10 years ago.
Okay. When
I read DeVries' study in 2014, I thought it was wonderful. And I published a paper criticizing it 2 years ago. So yes. I've come a long way in understanding how things get to be done and versus how things should get to be done. And as you indicated in the introduction, in 1998, I was the chairman of the committee that did WPATH standards of care. And I can tell you, we had no concept of evidence-based medicine. We had no concept of a systematic review. I and the other 8 people on that committee did not have a hierarchy in our mind of evidence-based medicine. We didn't review any studies. All we did was talk about what we thought is the best thing to do. I'm guilty. I'm embarrassed at how little I knew and what a high position I had, you see? And even in 2014, I was far less methodologically aware than I am today. And so I think in some sense, my personal experience is generalizable, that we were happy to hear about suffering that could be cured, not helped. The Reese study said cure, no more gender dysphoria. And they basically imply they will live happily ever after.
Yeah. So that's and I'm actually speechless. I'm stunned by what you just said, because it really resonates with me as well. I believe that while we're learning, especially training for me, and even once you're in attending, there is just so much information out there. And then, in certain things, and there's little information in other things. And when there's only a little bit of information, you rely on the people who are experienced, who either work with you or are teaching you. And you really take their advice, and it's almost like the old see one, teach one, do one type of deal. And that's really problematic. But at the same time, we have to always be thinking out of the box and thinking about the things that we do know and how do we apply them. Because as you said earlier, every patient is complex. Every person is an individual with completely different needs, cultural needs, social needs, medical needs, economic needs, all of those things. And we can't, and some new disease is going to come along, something new that we haven't seen before, and we are only equipped with the knowledge that we have of other diseases. And that's, yeah, I'm almost speechless, because I felt like that too, and I felt the same way. Through COVID for me was the biggest recent example of that, in addition to the gender medicine. I just feel like people were taking things that they applied, or things that they had unlearned, about things that they applied. And then we were all just saying, okay, do this. Like in the beginning with COVID, we were all putting everybody on ventilators, because that's what we knew how to do in the intensive care unit, was put patients on ventilators when they have bad respiratory illness. And then later we found out that killed people. So we needed to stop doing that. I imagine it's similar for this.
Yeah, I think I can summarize what both of you said. Medical education, whether you're a resident or there's a chain of trust. Someone on above you tells you how to treat a particular problem. I don't know how many diseases that you have to master when you're qualified as a pediatrician. Let me just say I'm going to make up a number. There are 250 diseases that you have to know about in order to be qualified as a pediatrician. And so you can't possibly have a critical sensibility about the therapeutics of 250 things. You're a resident. You have to pass your boards. You have to believe the chain of trust. What happened in 2014 when DeVries said gender dysphoria, it can be cured with these kind of patients, right? If you only do this. All of us throughout the world we assumed that they were people in a high place because they did research, even though it was not a controlled study, right? We believed it. The chain of trust came from DeVries, and it got rapidly adopted throughout the world. There was no skepticism. That group was considered to be the world's finest researchers and the best of clinicians. You see, we had the chain of trust. And what's happened to you and Chris and me is that we've come in our own ways at our own time. We've come to see that the chain of trust is not trustworthy, and it's not inherently trustworthy.
Yeah.
That's my summary. The chain of trust is not to be believed in any particular disease to be trustworthy. In particular, that's what Chris and I have been saying. We don't trust this stuff.
Can I also add that there must be some component of the general loosening of criteria or the depathologization of gender, what used to be gender identity disorder moving to gender dysphoria, which philosophically was sort of seen as a move to depathologize and you could say normalize cross-sex feelings. And I think whenever you have moves in the DSM, which is the main people call it the Bible of psychiatry, but it is a book written once again by experts, and it moves us in a certain direction. And I think that we probably didn't have, because you'll notice in our society we have a lot of assumptions about disparities and unequal outcomes and problems, all coming from discrimination, and that discrimination is the problem. And if we can just get rid of discrimination, then we won't have a problem anymore. And I think part of what needs to be really talked through in a nuanced, sophisticated way is, what are the trade-offs of seeing gender as a completely and cross-sex feelings, if you want to say transgender identification, as 100% normal and healthy variant that people are saying. I mean, this is what is now being promoted by WPATH. It's now what's promoted by the American Academy of Pediatrics. And I think people took that as a position without actually talking through what is the reality. Because if that's your position, I mean, we do know that there are some individuals who have become psychotic and in the midst of their psychosis have believed themselves to be the other sex, right? That's a known, there's historical and other, episodes that happen. So we know for sure that at least on some extreme times, their gender dysphoria is related to psychosis or other mental illness, right? So we have to have at least some index of suspicion that gender dysphoria and transsexualism, or feeling that you're the other sex, has some relationship to some type of psychological problem. And when you have a group like WPATH or the American Academy of Pediatrics saying that, no, this is all 100% normal and we should support it and celebrate it and all this, I'm just like, okay, well, where was the discussion about the trade-offs that come when you depathologize? And how is this going to impact especially young people who have lots of psychological or neurobiological or neurodevelopmental issues when we decide that we're going to affirm their trans identification? So I think like this opened a door, the depathologization is still a subject that till this day we've not fully discussed through in our journals. We've not really evaluated what are the trade-offs, what are the pluses, what are the minuses, like we do in other things in medicine. So yeah. I don't, so I'm perplexed and upset that we've not had the rigorous constructive disagreement so we can get closer to the truth and serve our patients better.
So if I can put what Chris said in some historical perspective, in 2010, a committee of the American Psychiatric Association made a fiat, a declaration with no study behind it, that any form of gender identity is normal. That was 2010. That's when the committee first floated that idea. It was the official American psychiatric policy in 2 years later, in 2012. Again, there was no systematic review. Are these people, there's any form? In those days, there were about 15 different forms of gender identity. No one did a study, and when we talk about, you see, when homosexuality was depathologized, it was based on a study, a blind study. Yes. In 2010, there was no study. There was a group of people who thought they knew how to improve the suffering of trans identified people. And this was how to declare them normal. And the analogy was there was more therapy in 1974 when the American Psychiatric Association declared homosexuality normal than all the previous therapy for homosexuals. So they were just following that historical precedent. And even today I hear this because they talk about conversion therapy, and you try to shock homosexuals out of their preferences, you see. So I just think Chris is really helpful. Is really helping us all understand this. But it came by fiat. It came by decree. It did not come from anything like science. It came from the compassionate well wishes of people who understood the suffering of trans people.
Yeah,
Yeah,
interesting.
and if I could just add one thing to clarify that what I'm saying too is not that we know that there's not some. I think that there are trans-identified adults who don't have psychopathology, right? I think that I'm not saying that's the case, but usually in medicine we've clumped different patients in different categories, and we try to figure out, hey, what are we dealing with? Early onset gender dysphoria and late onset seem to be quite different phenomena. And usually in medicine, we would talk about them like they were different phenomena, but now they're all thrown together. So, which I think once again has been part of the problem because of the stigmatization of those who want to talk about this or have cautious care, especially within our professional organizations. They've driven the vast majority of physicians who actually are concerned and cautious underground, because you can't get up at a meeting and actually voice any real concerns you have, because then things are going to turn on you and you're going to be accused of being a bad person. And there you go.
Yeah,
Well,
I can absolutely vouch for that, having worked in academics before I defected. You don't even know whatever the other people are thinking about issues when the illusory consensus is dominating the room. If the people who are silent, you have no idea what they're thinking.
Yeah,
They could be they could be in agreement, or they could be self-censoring.
it's
There's usually one disruptor who will speak up and ask questions, or say, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. And then that person is often, the one that takes the beating, and then nobody else, it really gives some confirmation to the people who decided to self-censor, and then they just, stay quiet. And that's how it is in medicine. And most cultural and social situations, someone will come up to you afterwards and say, yeah, I totally agree with you on that. But for some reason in academic medicine, they just don't do that. They don't out themselves at all. So it does become a large self-censorship of the we can't even say they're the minority of of thinkers. We don't even know. We have no idea. It seems like the small minority are the ones who are actually making those decisions. I'm gonna our questions are piling up in here, so I'm gonna try to get some in here that are really kind of related to what we talked about. Chris, I think it was you brought up how the different kind of sort of categories of patients, and how we just sort of decided to just kind of mesh them all together, not do any differential diagnosis, which is really our standard practice. And Cindy Stokes asked, did the concept of social contagion just get ignored? If not, how did it get rejected? Do you think it was ignored? Do you think it was rejected? Or?
Well, I think there was a campaign to stigmatize anyone who brought up the idea of social spread, I will say. If you say social spread, it's a little bit nicer than contagion. People don't like that word.
Yeah.
And so if you look at the panic that occurred after Lisa Littman put out her 2018 paper regarding what she was calling rapid onset gender dysphoria, I mean, there was an absolute panic in the community, which had already determined that that her thesis to explain the rise went against many of the gender affirming care principles. And basically, as we now see in the Cass report, there was not a lot of evidence to support their thesis. And this really blew a lot of holes in it. And so she had to be stigmatized and punished. And so it's interesting because it seems clear that there is social spread. The evidence is quite obvious that there is social spread of gender dysphoria. but no one in organized medicine really wants to talk about it, and you'll have a real hard time getting a paper published on it in any journal associated with any of our major medical associations. There are some other journals that are not associated with major medical associations that will publish quality articles on that subject, but not in the ones run by our medical associations, because it would go counter to their official position, and they can't have their journals running articles with data that counters their advocacy positions.
Yeah.
So you can see how troubled, why they need to panic when people bring up the social spread of this phenomenon.
Okay. One of the things that that I'm seeing consistently, going to the AAPA meeting and looking at the responses of the American Academy of Pediatrics, American Society of Endocrinology, and their response to the CAS reviews, we're already doing this. We are acting on the evidence. We are basing. And so someone asked, when was the term evidence-based medicine first used? But I think we should also kind of sort of talk about how do we interpret how do we combat this idea that we're using the evidence? No, we're using the evidence. You're not using the evidence. How do we meet in the middle when we're so polarized based on all of these other factors that are coming into our decision making? Who gets who wins in the evidence-based medicine battle, I guess?
Well, I think that question is being answered in courtrooms, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But the answer to the first part of the question, I think evidence-based medicine as a concept was born in the early 90s by a guy named Gordon Guyat. And it grew slowly into the medical sensibilities in various fields. All fields need to claim that they're doing evidence-based medicine because of our value system, you see, because one of the ethical principles is that everything we do is based on the best understanding of science. So now that we have evidence-based medicine has become much more sophisticated, widespread in the understanding of the age system, for example. And we recognize that at the height of the triangle of evidence-based medicine is the systemic review. So all the systemic reviews agree that the quality of evidence is very low and low, which means you can't guarantee the benefits, and you can't assure yourself that the harms won't outweigh whatever benefits are there, especially in the long run, right? So when you're on one side, you think everyone else is denying science and is actually lying because they have an axe to grind. And when you switch sides, they feel the same way about the other. So what you were saying is that both sides accuse the other of being science deniers, basically.
Yeah.
Now, I really don't think we need courtrooms to make a decision about this. I think we need the body of medicine to make this decision, right? But because we're polarized, what I think the CAS report has done has been a dispassionate, objective look, carefully done, and reminding everybody that the welfare of children and adolescents and adults is at stake, and that we have an ethical responsibility, if not a moral responsibility, to make sure that we're not harming people and make sure that we're helping people. Dr. Cass said, she, like Chris said, there may be some people who would benefit from this. The trouble is, in our current state of knowledge, we don't know which ones. And I think the affirmative care people actually think they know. But I think the systemic reviews have demonstrated, and I actually think, well, the CAS report talks about 8 reviews. There were 6 systemic reviews done before the CAS report. So that's 14 reviews that are all, including the one that WPATH commissioned, right? They've all
Yes.
reached the same conclusion.
Yes.
And so, I think they're the science deniers, but I'm accused of being a science denier, you see, and Chris would probably be accused of being a science denier. And so, okay, this is where we are. It's a shame. It's a shame that the courts have to decide, because what does a judge know about science, right?
Right.
Not very much sometimes is
Yeah.
one thing I would say. I think the other way to look at this is, just like Dr. Levine was saying, part of the value of systematic reviews is that they humble us about what we know and what we don't know. And that, I think, is really important when you're offering treatments that potentially could do harm, that we really need to be humble about what we know and what we don't know. And this field has been rife with people making claims as if they knew what the outcome would be, so let history decide, and maybe we'll get more science and we'll know more at some point. But it is very clear that many people have been making claims about gender affirming care that they cannot stand on. And in fact, probably the best example is that WPATH's own review said that there's not evidence to make any declaration whether hormones reduce or increase suicide. They couldn't say anything about them. And to this day, WPATH keeps claiming that they're life-saving, right? So this is, they did their own systematic review, and then they didn't want to listen to what it said. So I think it's pretty clear that there's a group of people who really don't want to, they don't want to be honest that the science hasn't gone their way.
Yeah.
So I contend that anyone who practices in any field of medicine is humbled by the process of how many problems we can't really cure, or we can't even improve upon. We see suffering in any field of medicine. It's not just psychiatry or pediatrics and so forth. And when I see a doctor whose speech doesn't acknowledge by tone, for example, or by what is said about the humbling nature of being a physician, I kind of think I'm not going to respect this person, right? Because I'm humbled every day by the helplessness of, and I'm considered to be, a good doctor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I just think humility just comes with practice, right?
Yeah.
And humility comes if you're a research scientist, because at every end of every study that you write, you have to point out the limitations, and the limitations better than the reader understands it. Yeah. So even research is humbling. If you read Hillary's report, even parts of it, you can feel her humility.
Yeah.
Right? You can feel it. That's, to me, respect worthy.
Yeah. It makes me think about this idea. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do it, of course. But there's two things that come to mind when you say that, and when you say what you just said. One is, do physicians in the United States, compared to the European nations, have more of a sort of a God complex, in that, we know the answer, we're just going to do this and take over this? Or is it just, I don't even know if you can't even call it humility, I don't think, because you don't know something and you're uncertain about what to do, but you want to help, so you got to do something, but you can't admit that you don't know, so you go ahead and you just do anything. So what is that drive? Like, there's got to be, and especially when it comes to children, because just remember, we're talking about children. They have the rest of their lives together, and these are physically healthy children for the most part, and deciding to do things that are going to permanently either disfigure them, or just alter their minds, alter their development, their natural development. And we aren't even looking to take the same approach as we would with an adult and say, let history decide, is completely immoral and unethical. So, how do we turn that off? Where do we go from here?
Listen, I want to say something positive about the people on the other side. If you were a surgeon and you were going to take off the breasts of a 15-year-old healthy person, you must believe you're helping that person. If you're a doctor prescribing estrogens to a male or testosterone, you can't do that, given your ethical understanding of above all, do no harm, if you believe what you and I are talking about tonight, right? You have to believe it in order to preserve your sense that you are on the side of angels. You see, you can see what we're up against. We're changing the sensibilities, the fundamental internal value system of surgeons and endocrinologists and people who are recommending care. They think they're helping people. So our questions about science and what's yours, which side is the science denier? It's up against the psychology of being a doctor. And see, I believe that they're well-intentioned, but misinformed.
Well, that's the part to me that is unforgivable, because we all have the ability to be informed. So I get the compassionate part and wanting to help and but the next steps are on us. We should all look at the evidence for ourselves. It's the same thing, and I even talk to my kids. I've got 2 teenage girls. And if they go on the, internet and they see something and they tell me something as it is fact, and they have not looked up, the source information themselves, or at least looked at multiple sources, to get a different, viewpoint or understanding of it, then that's, if they go out and share that information and they're passing on something that they can't be sure is real, or true. And so I believe, as people who are privileged to enter intimate relationships with people in their most vulnerable moments, it is our obligation to have the best information, have all of the information before we make a decision. And if I'm a surgeon and I've got a 14-year-old girl lying on my table and I'm going to take off her breasts, I can't imagine not diving through the evidence and looking at what's there before I do that.
They've been taught by people above them. They've been trained that in every study of mastectomy in the literature, in the opening paragraph says this helps people.
Yeah,
it's already a fact. This is how you can help people. You do. They don't even call it mastectomies. They have a euphemism. It's top surgery, top and bottom surgery, right? It's not bilateral mastectomy.
Right.
I see it, when you leave the surgical suite, and there's a bucket with 2 breasts in, it's mastectomies.
Yeah.
But when you don't want to think about this, it's top surgery. It's such a benign sounding thing. You're just fixing a problem. That's all. Right?
Yeah.
So it's up to us to have a compelling presentation that shows that what you're talking about, the evidence isn't there, and this is an ethical problem. Calling them names, I don't think is helpful. And I think why I'm so admiring of the Cass report is that in a very calm, dispassionate, objective way, she has marshaled the evidence and recognizing the complexity and the various stakeholders. Now, the stakeholders that she didn't talk about were the surgeons and the endocrinologists and the psychiatrists who were referring, glibly, quickly, and so forth. And the pediatricians who were telling mothers of the 6-year-old, the best thing to do is, to transition them.
Yeah.
you must take off your hats to WPATH's influence, the political influence of WPATH to change the sensibilities of doctors. As you were saying, for every other situation in medicine, one doesn't get polarized like this. The controversies are recognized as well. It's good we can articulate the controversies. Some bright person is now going to set up an experiment, and we're going to solve the problem. You see, so this is such a special case, and because people gravitated it literally 10 years ago in America, where all those clinics started getting formed and all those revenue streams started for hospitals and so forth, right? There was no critical sensibility, you see, and people believed it. They believed they were helping these people because they saw suffering. They didn't see the sources of suffering very clearly, because they said the suffering is from gender incongruence. And, you know, people like Chris and I think, well, there are other things causing this person to be suffering, right? And let's over time try to figure out what could we help with. And one of the things that we have to help with is to educate young people about what adolescence is all about. Anyway.
Yeah, let me throw in, I mean, I think the cast review does show that, at least in England, they have a culture in medicine that's different. And I think it does point to some of the problems in our culture in medicine. And I think there are pockets of our medicine system that work really, really well. And there are pockets that do not work well. And same thing with our professional organizations. Our professional organizations do a lot of things right, and they actually have done a lot of good things. And I'm still involved, and I think they can reform. They've gone off the rails in the past. They can reform again. We do want to have these organizations because they bring people together. They sponsor the conferences. They organize journals, and in the best possible world, they're doing a lot of good. I think they need to look at, we need something like a cast review that's going to look at how this situation arose. I believe that there was a lot of groupthink and a lot of socially constructed pressures within these organizations that caused people to not be able to speak up and not be comfortable speaking up, and that allowed some of these chains to go on. And I think we do have to realize that we are much more social creatures than we think we are. We're smart, and everyone who goes to medical school is smart, but are they using the smarts to really examine the evidence, or are they using the smarts to say things that will raise their social status within their group? And so what the dynamics become is, oh, okay, this is the thing that people really are getting behind, and this is what people like. I'm going to use my brain power to get on that side, and this did become very tribal, where those who are sort of for this are the sophisticated, smart people who really get it. And anyone who's raising concerns must be a bad person and, transphobe, and really needs to be stigmatized and shamed. And unfortunately, that seems to be the dynamic that took over in parts of these medical organizations, which helped lead. And I think that happened to WPATH first, but I think it happened within the organizations and really stopped us from having constructive disagreement on this issue.
So if we were talking about how long we should anticoagulate someone who has a DVT, okay? And Dr. Johnson, you said 2 years, and I said 4 years, and Chris said 10 years, and someone else said forever. We disagree, okay? This is our best clinical judge. I would not call you a name because you don't agree with me. I wouldn't call Chris a name because he didn't agree. We wouldn't stop being friends, right? We wouldn't accuse you of being unscientific. We would say, science doesn't know the answer. How can we find the answer, right? There's no animosity. There's no passion. There's just the ego. I think this. And with my patients, I say 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, right? Okay. So, all right, that's medicine, right? in gender, I call you names. I insult you, right? And I keep you off the podium because I don't want to hear what you have to say. And this is a unique thing in medicine. And Dr. Cass noticed that, and she spoke about that.
Yeah. Well, honestly, I don't think I'm as optimistic as the two of you are about how we're going to get out of this, but I do agree. It should not be our court system. Our court system and politicians who don't really know medicine should not be entering the exam room. I have really strong feelings about that. It should be up to us to get this right. But in the meantime, I know parents are concerned. I'm a parent too, and I've seen the influence that, this ideology has had on my own kids, my own, kids' school, which prompted me to start a local group, parent group. And so I hope that we will get it together sooner or later, the sooner rather than later. But we have about 20, like less than 18 minutes left. So I want to get to some of these questions in the chat. I want to see if I can find some that aren't so. Anonymous attendee writes, part of the problem is the social pressure. I'm in medical writing and deal with academic medical journals. If I push back on a call with other writers who are discussing changing the language standards to accommodate, say, pronouns, I'm risking being ostracized or blacklisted and could lose work. How do I navigate this corrupt power structure?
Well, that'll keep us quiet.
Right.
Well, I think, this is, that's a similar, and if, like I was saying earlier, we have this idea, there's a number of sort of general ideas that I think have grown through academia. One of them I mentioned earlier was this idea that if there's disparities or there's a group that's not doing well or has problems, it's because they're being treated badly. And the solution is to not treat them badly. And it seems absurd to me to think that this is a group. Are we saying that this group is so fragile that they can't hear the actual biological sex? Is that, and we have to make up new pronouns to, so I think there's that disparities piece and also this primacy of identity. And I think, obviously talking about discrimination and disparities is important, but we need to be facts-based about it. And the identity is important, but it's not everything. And we have to be able to push back against this idea that identity is I think our common humanity is much more important than these identities that we're dividing ourselves into. And I think the more we push to divide ourselves into different identities, the more conflict and trouble that we're going to have. But I don't have an easy solution because we have created stigmatization of those who stand up and basically say what I just said. And somehow we need more people saying that so that we can normalize that, which used to be seemingly how society was operating.
So my answer to that complex question that's out of my field is when people want to change the language, I would want to say this is a very interesting hypothesis that you have underneath this. You're suggesting a policy change, but it's based on a hypothesis. I actually have a different hypothesis, and I don't know how to, at this moment, resolve the differences. But you're suggesting a new policy that's based merely on a concept, a hypothesis that's not proven. It happens to be socially acceptable and in fashion in certain groups in society, but it's merely a hypothesis. And the question for all of us is, what should policies be based on? Should it be based on values? Should it be based on ethical principles? Should it be based on science? Should it be based on political movements? Today's liberal is tomorrow's conservative and vice versa. Yeah. And so it's important, I think, to recognize how policy gets made, but it's really based on assumptions or hypotheses. The word hypotheses, at least to some ears, is a respect-worthy caution that it's not fact. It's an assumption. So science has one way of dealing with assumptions, that we have experiments, clinical experiments or other experiments, but other branches don't have science, and they sometimes confuse hypotheses, fashionable hypotheses, with policy. And that puts policy, makes it vulnerable to being incorrect, and it's usually done to help people, but they don't consider who they harm, which I think gets back to what Chris was saying earlier.
Yeah. Okay, there was a great question. Where did it go? Gosh. John Bingham asks, the question all clinicians have to answer. If you see a trans-identified patient for a complaint unrelated to their trans medicine, and you feel they have been harmed by hormonal treatment or surgery, what can you realistically do to help that patient in one 20-minute clinic visit? This is given that the patient is likely indoctrinated in the ideology that forbids questioning of trans medicine, and their trans medicine physician is a true believer. What is your obligation to the person in front of you?
Well, I'll go in that I often have situations where patients are in front of me and they have problems. I can't solve their problems. And those are problems that at that moment they don't want to solve, or they are not seeking my help for. So I don't think that that's so uncommon in mental health and psychiatry, that sometimes you see that patients have done things that are maybe not in their own best interest, or they're are doing something that is problematic, but they're not really in change mode and they don't have good insight into it. And so in your scenario, I think we're always there to support them. We're always there to be open to conversations at some later point. And we do have to just sort of do what we can do and keep that open stance with them.
So I don't think we should assume that because a person is unhappy and is transitioned, with hormones or surgery, that their unhappiness is coming from their trans status. I want to inquire about what the sources of unhappiness are. And it could be that they broke up with somebody, or their mother is dying, or whatever. So I want to go to the individual. I want to interrogate the situation so that I have a reasonable hypothesis that the patient agrees with or agrees to think about, that this is the source of my suffering.
All right. Well, as the the medical doctor on the panel, I would answer that with, if you see something that looks like it is, that the patient has been harmed, or sort of something obvious physical defect, then bring it up and ask the patient, is this an issue for you? Is this a concern? I see that you have scar tissue in this area. Is this a concern for you? I see that you have a lot of facial hair. Is that problematic for you? Or acne? Any of those things, and just acknowledge that you see it. Is that a problem for you? And if it's not, you move on. You're not, the patient came to you for one problem. That's what you're obligated to address. But yes, ethically, morally, I mean, if you see something, if I see something that was done wrong, or then I'm going to try my best to correct it. Even if it's a medical. If something else, it's surgical, medical, I could see a weeping wound and you came to see me about something else, I'm going to try and address that. So.
This is a buyer beware kind of stuff. People want a treatment, they find a doctor who gives them a treatment, and as they come to realize the consequences of those treatments that they never conceptualized before, right?
Yeah.
Then they act today and they regret later.
Yeah. Well,
and so, as a psychiatrist, maybe not as a pediatrician, but as a psychiatrist, I'm trying to explore the meaning of symptoms to a person, the feelings behind the symptoms, the conflicts, the dilemmas behind the symptoms, right? So I have the privilege of, because I structure my time, I have the privilege of seeing people for 50 minutes and sometimes even longer.
Yeah.
So I'm able to explore this. I want to explore this before affirmative care. But if people are willing to, I mean, I have people who transition and come to see me, and we talk about their dilemmas, and they're formidable. Some of them.
Yeah, well, I mean, that also goes back to whether or not they received informed consent before proceeding, or their parents received informed consent. And so that's also a question that needs to be examined if the US decides to ever do extensive reviews on how we're practicing gender medicine here.
Yeah.
All right, let's see, there's lots of comments. Let's see, James Myrtle, any advice on how to inject some of this sanity at the school board level? Our prior experience with COVID has not been effective. James, I'm assuming that you are meaning how to address the topic within the public school system, and teachers bringing up sex and sexual identity and gender identity, all of those things, sexual orientation, what age is appropriate, sometimes it's not appropriate, what books are introduced, those kinds of things. I think you need to communicate directly with your school board as a parent. I think you need to communicate directly with your child's teachers. Make sure they have all of the available resources. My local parent group, we are giving away copies of textbooks. We're sending resources to them. It's happening in every school, type of school, independent schools and public schools. And you just really have to stay on it and set boundaries, things that you can have your child opt out of, then have them opt out of it. It's one of the most difficult dilemmas. That's something that I never thought I would face as a parent. But it's not something that's insurmountable. You can do it. And find some like-minded parents who are with you, because that's unfortunately, this goes back to the self-censoring too. I'm not sure what kind of town you live in, James, but or the school where my kids are is, they're pretty mixed kind of politically, but I had no idea how people would respond. But I had gotten to the point where I was really fed up with things, and I just sent a mass email out, used the whole entire school directory, and sent an email about, I have questions. And that's how I met people, and we formed a group. So it takes one person to ask and be brave enough to to start to ask questions and push back. So
And can I mention that
and I
don't
survived,
even know.
so-
I mean, I think GenSpec has a school.
They do.
They have a, so GenSpec has
Yeah.
resources, and there's other toolkits on the way.
Yep.
So I
Yep.
think use the resources that exist to educate some of the school members who really
Yep.
might have heard things that they've really a lot of times only heard one side and believe they're doing the right thing. So if you approach them with the sense that they believe they're doing the right thing and they intend to do well, even if they're doing something misguided, maybe with a little bit of education and, if need be, firm discussion, then you can do the best you can do with the school you got.
Well, school boards are probably very mindful of the school boards that have been sued for their policies and lost. So that's another thing to remind people about. This matter is being adjudicated in the courts in various states, and there already have been victories saying that school boards cannot be teaching these things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, then you also have a bill that's just gone through, or at least is in debate in California, that allows schools to keep information about children with identifying as an opposite gender. from their parents. So, you know, you get the legislature on board, and it's a state law. Then you have to push back citizens petitions and and unfortunately you have to go through the courts. There's no way to change public, you know, policy without some legal intervention, and that's either through creating that law or breaking down that law with litigation. All right, I'm going to go through one more. Leslie Sudak has a lot of comments and questions on here. I'm going to try and pick one that we think you can answer and pretty fast. Let's see. All right, Leslie, where is this? How do doctors conceive of informed consent in the absence of commitment to evidence-based medical treatment practice?
And I just quickly say, Dr. Levine wrote a great article on that, so I'll let him mostly answer, but I think it has been a travesty what has happened with regard to informed consent. And probably now it's a lot better than it used to be, but it's still, I'm sure, a problem. So go ahead, Dr. Levine, since you have already explored this topic so thoroughly.
Well, my co-authors and I were just pointing out the limitations of informed consent as we understood it being practiced across the world. I want to say that informed consent is not signing a form. It's not only understanding the short-term or the long-term risks of hormones. It's a process that should be done in the ongoing relationship between the professional and the parents and the child. As you know, someone less than 18 cannot give informed consent, even if the doctor thinks they're capable of it. So the parents have to consent. But the parents have to be informed of the absence of information about long-term outcomes and the falsity that this will save your child's life. And they have to be informed about what the systemic reviews have said. So we have to admit, you parents and me, clinician, may decide that it's a reasonable thing to give this child some hormone or something, but we have to all understand why we're doing it and what the limitation of knowledge is about this. And as someone read the article on informed consent, they said, well, who in their right mind, if they actually believe what you were saying, Dr. Levine, who in their right mind would ever consent to this? And I said, isn't that an interesting idea?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so one of the critiques of the article was that I was just trying to scare, or we authors were just trying to scare parents out of this. And I thought, isn't that an interesting thing to say? We're trying to inform the parents about what the dangers are. Yeah. Right. We're not, they can't give, the parent can't consent to hormones. We're just saying they should knowingly understand what the benefits are that are hoped for and what science knows about the dangers, you see? So I had a patient recently went to an endocrinologist who told the parents, it's fine. The hormones are safe. And the mother said, they're safe. You mean the doctor quoted a study, a 5-year study, that there was no heart attack or something. The mother was very sophisticated and said, what's going to happen on hormones in suggestions that there's cardiovascular disease, you see? Mm-hmm. Oh, I only know about 5 years. You see, this is a pediatric endocrinologist talking. Yeah. He doesn't follow people when they're 40. So, you know, informed consent, it does scare people. It should scare people.
Yes.
But it doesn't mean they can't make a decision because they know their child better than the doctor does.
Absolutely. Right? Yeah.
So,
and that, you know, I think that's a great way to kind of to wrap things up. It is 10 o'clock. Thank you both so much for your generous amount of time. I could talk about this all night, but I'm sure you have to go. And our audience has been wonderful. We've had lots of great questions, lots of comments. Also, I am reminded that to let everybody know that if you enjoyed this and would like to continue to see more, we're gonna remember there is a webinar coming up on June 13th where Leslie Sellen Davis will be moderating, our fair advisor and journalist, on this same topic, with a panel of journalists. So from the sort of kind of the political end and the media response to the cast review. We will also have the recording of the session will be available. Gavin, please tell me when that will be available so I can pass that on to the audience, or if you wouldn't mind typing that in the chat. But also, if you enjoy our content, please go to fairforall.org and click that donation button and give us just whatever you can, because everything we do is donor sponsored. So everybody, we're a nonprofit organization with a small staff, and anything you can contribute would be wonderful. And sign up, register, and then you'll get emails from me or look at our newsletter to know when the next webinar will be and other events, and get resources and information.